Picture a car worth more than $1 million, sitting in a garage, completely locked and completely useless, because nobody inside or outside can get the door open. The key does nothing. The remote does nothing. The handle, both inside and outside, simply refuses to move the lock at all. That is exactly the strange and frustrating problem a man named Mat Armstrong ran into with his own Bugatti Veyron, one of the rarest and most expensive cars ever built. This was not a simple case of a stiff door that needed a little extra force. This was a full lockout, a door that acted as if it had a mind of its own, refusing every normal attempt to open it, no matter how the key, the remote, or the handle was used. For a car worth this much money, a problem like this is genuinely frightening, because it raises the fear of a repair bill running into thousands, or even a part that no longer exists and cannot easily be replaced. What makes this story so interesting is not just that Matt eventually solved the problem. It is what happened after he solved it, because the exact same kind of door trouble showed up again, months later, on a completely different Veyron, owned by a completely different person, repaired at a completely different workshop. And once people started comparing both cases side by side, they noticed something that reached all the way back to a famous moment from 2006, when Tom Cruise struggled to open a Bugatti door in front of hundreds of flashing cameras at a movie premiere. Suddenly, a small, almost silly mechanical problem on two rebuilt cars became linked to one of the most talked about celebrity car moments in history. This article will walk through the full story, step by step in simple language, so that even if you know nothing about cars, you can understand exactly what happened, why it matters, and why so many people are now looking at that old Tom Cruise clip in a brand new way. It is a story about broken locks, expensive cars, honest mechanics, and a mystery that sat quietly for 20 years until two ordinary garage repairs brought it back into the light. Along the way, we will also talk about why this story fits into a bigger pattern that has been building around Mat Armstrong and people like him, mechanics who are not afraid to show the real truth about supercars, even when that truth is less exciting than people expect. Sometimes the biggest problems on the most expensive cars in the world turn out to have the simplest explanations, and this is exactly one of those cases. It shows how a small, cheap fix can end up changing the way people understand a huge, expensive machine, and how a moment caught on camera years ago can suddenly make a lot more sense once someone finally figures out what was really going on underneath the surface. What makes this even more interesting is that none of the people involved set out looking for a 20-year-old mystery to solve. Nobody sat down and said, let's go back and figure out what really happened to Tom Cruise on that red carpet. Instead, the answer showed up almost by accident, arriving through two ordinary repair jobs that had nothing to do with Hollywood, nothing to do with old news stories, and nothing to do with trying to prove anyone right or wrong. That is often how the best discoveries happen. People are not always looking for the big answer. Sometimes they're just trying to solve a small, annoying problem right in front of them, and the bigger answer finds them along the way. This article will take its time walking through every part of this story, from the very first moment Mat Armstrong noticed something was wrong with his own car, all the way through to how this connects with a piece of pop culture history that most people thought they already understood completely. The story did not start with any big plan to solve an old mystery. It started with a man just trying to get into his own car. Mat Armstrong is well known online for taking apart broken supercars and explaining, in plain and honest language, what is really wrong with them. He does not hide behind confusing car terms. He shows the real parts, the real damage, and the real cost of fixing things. His Bugatti Veyron became one of his most talked about projects, partly because the car had been sitting in use for a long time before he got it. Cars that sit still for months or years, especially expensive ones, often develop strange problems that do not show up on cars driven every day. Rubber parts dry out. Metal parts can stick. Electrical parts can behave in odd ways after long periods without use. This is exactly what happened with Mat's Veyron doors. At some point, the doors simply stopped responding. Nothing seemed to work. The key would not open them. There was no click, no give, no sign of life in the lock. For most people, this would already feel like a disaster. But with a car as complex and expensive as a Veyron, the fear gets even bigger, because expensive cars often mean expensive fixes, and a locked door on a car like this is not something you just pry open with a crowbar without risking serious damage. Matt tried several things to get inside. He looked into every possible explanation he could think of. He even went as far as taking the car apart in his search for an answer, tried to reach the lock system from different angles, hoping to find some way to release it safely. Still, nothing worked. At one point, based on what he later described, he felt like giving up entirely, unsure if there was any way to solve the problem without causing more damage or spending a huge amount of money on new parts. Then, almost by accident, he ended up giving the door a firm knock with his hand out of frustration. To his surprise, right after that knock, the door opened. It was not a dramatic fix. It was not some rare part or expensive tool. It was simply a hit on the door, followed by pulling the handle, and suddenly it worked like nothing had ever been wrong. This moment might sound small, but it turned out to be much bigger than anyone expected, because it was about to happen again on a completely different Veyron, owned by someone else entirely, in a situation that had nothing to do with Mat's car. And when it did happen again, it would raise a much bigger question about how many people, over the years, may have run into this exact same problem without ever understanding why. It also raises a quieter question that is easy to miss at first. How many Veyron owners over the years simply assumed their car needed a costly repair, called a specialist, and paid a large bill for a problem that could have been fixed with nothing more than a firm knock on the door? There is no way to know the answer for certain, but it is a reasonable thing to wonder about once you understand how simple the real fix turned out to be. Mat Armstrong did not set out to make this discovery in some planned, careful way. He was simply frustrated, tired of trying every trick he could think of, and in that moment of frustration, almost giving up entirely, he ended up finding the one thing that actually worked. That kind of accidental discovery is more common in the world of car repair than people might expect. Mechanics who work with their hands every day often stumble onto solutions through trial and error rather than through instruction manuals, because manufacturers do not always document every possible failure a car might develop after years of sitting unused. This is especially true for a car as rare and unusual as the Veyron, a car that was never produced in huge numbers and that very few mechanics in the world have ever taken apart down to this level of detail. Because of that, some of the most useful knowledge about how these cars actually behave does not come from the factory. It comes from people like Mat Armstrong, working alone in a garage, refusing to give up on a locked door. After months of work, another man named Mark McCung finally reached a big moment with his own Bugatti Veyron. His car had been through a long and difficult repair process at a well-known workshop called Longer, and for a long time, most of the attention on his car had been focused on gearbox trouble, which many people believe would cost an enormous amount of money to fix. When that chapter of the story finally came to an end, everyone expected the hard part to be over. Instead, a brand new problem appeared, one that had nothing to do with gearboxes or engines. Out of nowhere, the car went into what is known as anti-hijack mode, a safety feature built into the Veyron that is meant to lock the car down completely if the system senses something is wrong, such as an attempt to break in. But this time, there was no break-in attempt at all. The system had triggered on its own, and both doors locked completely, refusing to respond to anything. The key did not work. The remote did not work. Pulling the handle from outside did nothing. Pulling the handle from inside did nothing either. After everything Mark had already gone through to get his car repaired, he was suddenly facing a brand new obstacle. And this one was strange because it was not about a broken part that needed replacing. It was about a car that simply refused to let anyone in, with no clear reason why. At this point, Mark remembered something important. He recalled that Mat Armstrong had gone through almost the exact same experience with his own Veyron, the doors locking with no warning and no obvious solution. So instead of guessing or spending money on expert help right away, Mark decided to call Mat directly and ask him what had happened and how he had managed to fix it. This phone call turned into one of the most important parts of the whole story, because it is where the real explanation finally came out into the open. During the call, Mat explained exactly what he had done, including his failed attempt and how. In the end, it came down to something as simple as a knock on the door. He even suggested that Mark try keeping a screwdriver nearby in case tapping the door was not enough on its own, as a backup plan in case the same fix did not work right away. It was a moment filled with a mix of stress and humor. Two men trying to solve an expensive problem with something as basic as knocking on metal, half expecting it to fail. But then Mark tried it, and just like Mat's car, the door opened. The exact same method, tried on a completely different car, owned by a completely different person, worked the exact same way. At that moment, this stopped being just one unusual story about one strange car. It became a pattern, and patterns are exactly the kind of thing that make people start asking bigger questions. Think about how unlikely this would be if it really was just a random, one-off fault. Mark McCung's car had already been through a long and difficult rebuild process at a professional workshop, with skilled people working on it for months. If the door lock problem had simply been bad luck, something unique to a particular car, it would have made much more sense of fix to require some kind of new part, some kind of adjustment made by a trained technician using proper tools. Instead, the fix was the exact same basic action that had already worked on a completely different car, owned by a completely different person months earlier. The phone call between Matt and Mark also matters here, because it shows something important about how knowledge spreads within small, dedicated communities. These are not corporate engineers sharing information through official channels. These are individual car owners and hobbyist mechanics, learning from each other directly, sharing hard-earned lessons over a simple phone call rather than through any kind of formal manual or guide. That kind of informal knowledge sharing has become more and more valuable in the world of rare and unusual cars, especially cars like the Veyron, where official support and documentation can be limited, expensive, or simply hard to find. Without that phone call, Mark might have spent a large amount of money trying to solve a problem that ultimately needed nothing more than a firm knock and a little patience. Once both cases were compared side by side, the explanation became much easier to understand, even for someone who knows very little about cars. According to what Mat Armstrong explained, the Bugatti Veyron's door lock system can become dry and stiff after the car has spent a long period of time sitting unused, especially inside a garage where it might not move for months or even years at a time. Over time, without regular use, the small moving parts inside the lock mechanism can lose the smoothness they need to work correctly. When this happens, the lock does not fully break in the traditional sense. It simply becomes stuck, unable to release properly when someone tries to use the handle. Because the Veyron also includes a safety feature designed to lock the doors completely if anything seems unusual, a stuck lock can end up triggering that safety system, making the doors seem even more seriously broken than they actually are. This explains why, in both cases, the doors appear to be completely dead, with the key, the remote, and both inside and outside handles doing absolutely nothing. It looked like a major failure, the kind of problem that might require expensive replacement parts or specialist repair work. But the real solution turned out to be almost embarrassingly simple. A firm knock on the door, using nothing more than a closed hand, was enough to loosen whatever was stuck inside the mechanism just enough to let the handle function normally again. This is not something typically written in an owner's manual, and it is definitely not something most drivers would think to try if their expensive supercar doors suddenly refused to open. Yet it worked not once but twice on two separate Veyrons, each owned by different people, each repaired at different times and in different places. The fact that the exact same simple fix worked on both cars is what turns this from a random coincidence into something that looks much more like a real, repeatable mechanical pattern. If two independent cases show the exact same symptoms and the exact same solution, it becomes much more reasonable to believe that other Veyrons, sitting quietly in garages around the world, may have experienced or may eventually experience the same issue. This single discovery, mostly stumbled upon by accident, ended up opening the door, quite literally, to a much bigger conversation about how these cars behave after periods of inactivity, and how something as small as a knock on a door panel could end up mattering far more than anyone originally expected. It is also worth explaining, in the simplest terms possible, why a safety feature like anti-hijack mode would make an already sticky lock feel even worse than it really is. Anti-hijack mode exists to protect the car and the people inside it, and it is designed to lock everything down tightly the moment the system senses anything unusual happening with the door mechanism. When a lock is already struggling to move properly because it's dried out, the system may read that struggle as a sign of tampering rather than as a simple mechanical fault. Once it happens, the car essentially puts itself into full lockdown mode, refusing every normal attempt to open the door, which makes an already annoying problem feel far more serious and far more frightening than it actually is. This helps explain why both Matt and Mark describe the doors as completely unresponsive rather than just slightly stiff or slow. It was not a partial failure. It was a full shutdown, triggered by a safety system that was, in a strange way, doing exactly what it was designed to do, even though the real cause was nothing more than a dry, stuck lock mechanism rather than any actual threat to the CAR. I don't understand why this door problem became such a big topic of conversation. It helps to go back to the year 2006, to the red carpet premiere of Mission Impossible 3. This was a massive event, filled with photographers, fans, and reporters, all focused on capturing every detail of the arrivals. Tom Cruise, one of the most famous actors in the world at that time, arrived in a stunning Bugatti Veyron, a car worth well over $1 million, and one of the flashiest, most talked about vehicles on the planet. As cameras flashed nonstop, Tom Cruise stepped out of the driver's side and walked confidently around to the passenger door to let Katie Holmes out, clearly intending to create a smooth, impressive moment in front of the world's media. But instead of a smooth moment, something awkward happened. He reached for the door handle, and nothing happened. The door did not open. He tried again, pulling at the handle a second time, and still nothing happened. For several long seconds in front of hundreds of cameras, he struggled with the door, visibly confused and frustrated, while photographers continued snapping away, capturing every second of the uncomfortable moment. Eventually, after what felt like an unusually long delay for such a simple task, the door finally opened and the event continued. But the damage, in terms of public perception, was already done. That short, awkward struggle with the car door was captured on camera and quickly became one of the most replayed celebrity moments of that entire year. It spread across entertainment news, car enthusiast forums, and eventually became a kind of internet joke that resurfaced again and again over the years, whenever people talked about Bugatti or about celebrity car mishaps. For a very long time, the blame for that moment rested entirely on Tom Cruise. Many people assumed he simply was not familiar with the car, or that he fumbled the handle out of nervousness in front of the cameras, or that he made some kind of obvious human mistake. It became one of those moments that people love to bring up as an example of celebrity looking a little less polished than usual, despite being surrounded by luxury and glamour. For 20 years, that explanation went mostly unchallenged. Nobody seriously questioned whether the car itself might have been the actual problem. Nobody connected it to any kind of mechanical issue, mainly because nobody had any real evidence pointing in that direction. That is, until two completely unrelated Bugatti owners, working on their own personal projects years later, ran into a strangely familiar problem of their own. It is worth remembering just how much attention that 2006 premiere received at the time. Mission Impossible 3 was one of the biggest movie releases of that year, and Tom Cruise was, without question, one of the most famous and closely watched celebrities in the entire world. Every step he took on that red carpet was being recorded by dozens of photographers and video crews, all hoping to capture a perfect, polished image from magazines, news broadcasts, and entertainment shows. Arriving in a Bugatti Veyron was already a bold statement.